So, what is the truth behind the INJIL that the Quran talks about? So, to help cover this topic, I am joined today by Dr. Eddie Dalcour.
Hello, welcome. Derek, haven't seen you. When was the last time I saw you?
That would be California, our strong tower in California, I think.
Okay.
Last time we were hanging out together.
Remember. We've talked since then, but that was the last time. George's event with chicken, and I just remember the food he brings in.
Oh, it's always good. It's always so good.
That's why Anthony and I always go somewhere else to eat.
So the topic for today is the INJIL that the Quran talks about. What this is, how do we know what it is? I mean, we hear Muslims claiming over and over about this. It's also known as the gospel. A lot of English translations will just call it the gospel, straight up. But what does this actually mean, and what is it? So, Eddie, have you heard a lot of Muslims talk, or what are the claims about this?
Well, keep in mind, every group has a view. Every non-Christian group has some kind of reason why the Bible, Old and New Testament, is not reliable. They have some kind of excuse or reason. Also, non-Christian cults or groups or non-Christian religions who profess to be Christian, they have some kind of reason why, for example, sola scriptura is not true. They all have a reason why the sufficiency of Scripture is not true. And with many of these groups, one of the reasons is that the gospel that we have in our hands today is just simply not the gospel that was written by the apostles. Similar to Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, you have views that it was either lost or heavily corrupted. So we really don't know what we have in our hand today in terms of most Christians. The Jehovah's Witnesses and Muslims say it was there was a great apostasy. Whereas Islam will talk about the gospel that was true, that when Muhammad received it from Allah, it was sent down by Allah, showing his great ignorance of what the gospel actually was. And it was a guidance of light. It's how people were to judge. And if anyone fails to utilize the gospel, there are rebellious people. And we have all the surahs to testify of that. And as we were talking before, I think the INJIL or gospel, the Arabic term for gospel, is used about 12 times. So Muhammad had a very positive view of the gospel. The Quran had a very positive view of the gospel. In fact, Muslims for hundreds of years had a positive view of the gospel. And as you know, perhaps if we have time, we'll get into this part. For 400 years, that whole idea about corruption completely was vacuous. It just wasn't there. And because of Muhammad's ignorance of the New Testament, he actually thought the gospel was this book or books that were actually sent down, right? Kind of floated down, instead of being, historically, as we know, 4 narrative books written by not Jesus, but by the followers of Jesus who were eyewitnesses or who were companions sometime after Jesus's ascension. And so properly, they provided divinely inspired records, but it certainly wasn't a book that just floated down. And many Muslims will misinterpret Mark 1:1 to support Muhammad's claim. So you would think if the gospel, and writing on our point today, if the gospel was positive, a guidance, you should judge by it. It was a book that was actually sent down from Allah. Certainly, you would think that if Muslims were diligent in obedience and strict adherence to Allah in obeying the revelation, they would accept the gospel and they would embrace the content of the deity of Christ and the physical resurrection and the ascension and the concept of the Trinity. But of course, we know that's not the case. Any Christian who's attempts to evangelize Muslims, and they start to proclaim the Jesus of the gospel, most Muslims immediately go to a default mode against the New Testament Gospels. And their default is simply this: that's not the gospel that you have in your hand. I don't know what in the world you have in your hand. That was corrupted, or they'll blame. It's interesting. All the non Christian groups always blame the Trinity and the canon and all these things on the Roman Catholic Church, as if there was some ecclesiastical power, in the third century that said this book's in, this book's out, this doctrine's in, no, there was no ecclesiastical power like the Roman Catholic Church. In fact, I always make this point, and you probably experienced this too. When you mention the Trinity or deity of Christ to many Unitarian groups, including Islam, Watchtower, Oneness Pentecostalism, Jehovah's Witnesses, all these Unitarian groups that reject the Trinity. Unitarian is contra to Trinitarian. One of their arguments is at the Council of Nicaea. Everyone likes to pick on the Council of Nicaea. They all like to point to it. Council of Nicaea 325. That is where the Sabbath day was changed. That is where the books of the Bible were collected and invented. That is where the doctrine of the Trinity was invented. You saw the Tom Hanks movie Da Vinci Code. That is where the deity of Christ was invented. And of course, that's not true. So when you're dealing with Muslims, they too think that all of our doctrines came from the Roman Catholic Church, the Trinity, deity of Christ, and all these things. But the fact of the matter is, when you quote the gospel, they know that this is not the gospel that was in the hand of Muhammad that the Quran speaks positively of.
Now, we've claimed multiple times that the Quran speaks positively about that. I don't want any Muslim to be able to come on here and say, well, you never showed the references. Like we stated, it was referred to 12 times in the Quran, and I do have those references up there right now. This first one is 348. So that's 348. And it clearly states here that this is from Allah. So Allah is the one who taught Jesus about the Torah and the gospel. Going on through to the next reference we have, which is 365, which this one clearly says that the gospels weren't around during Abraham's time. So don't argue about that with Abraham, about his position, because he wasn't a Jew or a Christian, because the Torah and the gospel weren't revealed until after him. So that's a time period claim. So the first one is a claim of who owns it. The second one is a claim of when it was. So continuing on, we have 365. No, this is the next one is. This is actually 157. And this one again claims that they had the INJIL or the Gospels. So this is clearly defining, saying, hey, Christians, go and look at the Gospels. You'll find Muhammad there. So this is one of the claims that Muhammad's saying that he is found within them. So this is referring to the Gospels as an authority. So this INJIL is an authority. Continuing on down, we have, this is 4829. In this, again, they are claimed that the Jews and the Christians still have the INJIL. It is something that is there for them to go look as reference. So if it's using it as a reference, then it's a reliable reference, and it couldn't have been corrupted at the time of Muhammad. So going on down to the next one, we have 5727. And this one, again, claims that they are from Allah. So far we're seeing a trend. Either it's a claim of when you can find this, who it is from, and who currently has it at this time frame in order to go judge by it. Because again, a command that says, hey, go judge by this book implies that you still have that book in a reliable form. You can't use it as a good reference if it has been corrupted. So we have 546 here, which again confirms that they are Allah's possessions, that he is the one who revealed them, that he's the one who showed them. So this is Allah's authority placed upon them. And this one's very interesting because here it specifically makes the claim that the Gospels were given to Jesus and they confirm what has been given before them. That's an interesting phrasing. It does appear again later on. In fact, in our next reference, in 3:3, we find again, this is Allah talking to Muhammad, saying, hey, the book that we are giving to them, to you, so the Quran is again confirming what has come before it. So again, it's not saying, some people tried to translate this saying that the Quran has an absolute authority. That's not what the Arabic is saying. It is saying that it is confirming what has already come before it. So I'm just trying to speed through these quickly. So 547 again says that obviously we still have to have the INJIL because we are commanded to judge by it. And it even qualifies it further here by saying anyone who does not judge by it is of the disbelievers. So if you don't judge by the gospel, then you are of the disbelievers. You're an apostate. Yeah, there's a pretty heavy burden there. Again, this would make no sense if you did not have the gospels to judge by, or if they were corrupted. This would be absolute nonsense. Because why would you have to judge by a corrupted book in order to be one of the believers? Continuing on after that, we have 566. Now, as we're going through 5, these are carry more weight because Surah 5 and Surah 9 were both the last ones revealed, chronologically speaking. So there's no abrogation to these. These override everything else before it. So if there's a contradiction between this and another ayah, you take this one over the other one. So that would again imply for the last one, which told us to judge by the Gospels, or we are the disbelievers. This one clearly claims again that they have the INJIL, at least had the INJIL at one point, because it says if they would have only upheld the Torah and the Gospels. So it's implying that at least they had it at one point. Muslims can commonly look at this and say, okay, well, fine, they had it at one point, then they corrupted it. Well, if we look just a little bit further on down the line at 68, so we're 66 jumping to 68, it clearly states that they currently have it. In fact, if not, if you don't stand on it, then you're not standing for anything. So after that, we've got, again, these are the last ones revealed. So these are the last words on the INJIL itself. 110. Again, here Allah is claiming it as his own. This is his revelation that he presented to the people. So giving it, again, authority of Allah. Now, many Muslims can claim that this has been overwritten because now they got the Quran, and the Quran has more weight to it than the Gospels. Again, we haven't seen that in here. In fact, in this next one, and this is the last reference that we have to it, which is 9:111. Again, remember that 9 is one of the two that were revealed last. So these are, again, the last words on it. It is very clear that the Torah and the Gospel and the Quran are the words of Allah. In fact, it calls them the covenant of Allah and implies it as he is the one who keeps it. So, but the interesting thing here is that the Torah and the Gospel and the Quran are all in one list, and all that list is called the covenant. So it's all given equal authority in this ayah. So, on top of that, the final and last point that I would definitely look at as far as the Quran goes and the authority that's given to the INJIL, and implying that the INJIL is still something that they had during Muhammad's lifetime and during Muhammad's ministry, would be 1094, which is Muhammad. It seems that Muhammad was doubting the revelations that he was given, and this is Allah confirming them by saying, if you're in doubt, go ask those who were given the scriptures before you. So again, if you are in doubt, O Muhammad, so the ideal man, the one giving these revelations, go to these previous scriptures and get it from there. Go to these authorities and get it. Again, that would make no sense if, as many Muslims claim, it was corrupted before this point. So I'd say that there is no doubt, according to what is written in the Quran, that the Gospels were reliable at the time of Muhammad. So in the 7th century. So that is what the Quran has to say about it. So what would have been, if I were to go to a Christian during that time frame and say, the Gospels you have are reliable, what would they think I'm talking about?
If you were to ask a Christian that,
During
well,
that time period.
yeah, during that time period, they would have no problem seeing the gospel as the same gospel that was promulgated in manuscripts in the churches 100 years before that and 100 years before that. And you keep regressing, you keep going back, and you have the first century, they would have no problem. Keep in mind, before the 7th century, before the 6th and 7th and 8th century, we had the entirety of New Testament manuscripts already intact. In fact, we have right now, I was talking to you before the show, and I was telling you every time I do a message on manuscripts or something of a textual nature, I always have to update the numbers because we keep finding new stuff. So sometimes I look on old sermons or articles, and I say, oh no, I got to update this stuff. It's similar to having a copy of Josh McDowell, Evidence Demands a Verdict, from the 80s. Just, we found so much more. Right now, Derek, we have about 25 or 26, listen to this, possible 2nd century manuscripts of the New Testament. Within these 25 or 26 manuscripts of the New Testament. Now, for anyone who doesn't know what a manuscript is, it's a copy in the same language, in Greek. We call this a manuscript, right? A Greek manuscript of the New Testament. Within these 25 or 26 possible 2nd century manuscripts, we have about 40% of the New Testament, including John 1:1. 40% of the New Testament. Then by the 4th century, we have manuscripts that have the totality of the New Testament. So, answering your question, a Christian would say, I have the same gospel that was written by the 1st century authors. No one had a problem with that. In fact, the Quran doesn't have a problem with that. Why do you think today there's so many Muslim scholars that debate the exact nature of the Injil, of the gospel? The general view is that, because they have to have this view, it's either been corrupted beyond recognition, lost, like it just kind of disappeared, or some would assert there's elements of both. And as you know, there's very few Muslims who are intellectually alive to the area of textual criticism to sustain such an argument. And it really is an argument of a circle. It really is. Some Muslim, this is very interesting. Some Muslim scholars like Yusuf Ali, um, they believe that it may contain, the ones that we have now, it may contain some fragments of the original Injil, like might have some fragments. And of course, the fragments would be John 14:28, the Father is greater than I. That's true for them. Or John 20:17, my Lord, your Lord, my God, your God. So they like to look at those passages because, as Yusuf Ali taught, we may have some fragments. How convenient to say we have fragments. But the fact of the matter is, that's how the Christians would answer you because, and here's our main topic today, because they had a translation that was congruent on all essential doctrines in essential Christianity. All the doctrines, the essential Christian doctrines, are congruent, are set for, actually, some of the readings are comport with our modern Greek text, the critical text today. So regarding essential doctrines, they had a Bible. It was called the Peshitta, and I'll explain what that is in a second. But the fact of the matter is, there are no essential differences between the readings, the earliest readings of the New Testament manuscripts, second and third century, and the very latest ones, 15th and 16th century. And as we were talking about, on essential doctrines, first of all, Muslims like to point to all the variant readings because they read Bart Ehrman, and he talks about the variant, how many we have, and we have a lot. But of course, with a lot of manuscripts, you're going to get a lot of variant readings. A variant reading could be a misspelled word, it can be a omitted word, it could be somewhat of a different word. But the fact of the matter is, there's no viable variants that affect essential doctrines. And one more point before we look at the Peshitta. Ibn Hazm was a early Muslim scholar. He was the first person in the mid-centuries. He was the first person to assert the idea that the original INJIL had been. Now, this is the 11th century. He was the first one to assert that the original gospel mentioned in the Quran, as you read 12 times, was corrupted. He was the first one. No one before the 11th century, because that's when he made this proclamation. He was a Spanish scholar, Muslim scholar. No one for the first 4 centuries of Islamic history taught a doctrine of corruption because it didn't exist. As you pointed out, the Quran had a very positive view of the gospel. It was sent by Allah as a guidance to light, and so on and so forth. So for 400 years, no one ever had that idea. So to allege some kind of corruption or lost book theory, these kind of theories are utterly vacuous in terms of any historical evidence. No Christians ever, held to that. Where are these lost books? 400 years. And that's an incredible thing to try to sustain, that there was some kind of corruption when that view is 400 years within Islamic history old. That it's an old view. I mean, no one believed that. So the fact of the matter is, also some would assert that the gospel mentioned in the Injil was a combination of apocrypha or pseudepigrapha works, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Barnabas, and it's this weird collection. Others would assert that it's one book. Why do you think so many Muslims have so many different debates about the original Injil? Because no one debated it in the 7th century. Nobody debated the validity and the reliability of the gospel. It's today, after 11th century, that they now debate it, because if you let the New Testament stand, here's what you have. You have Jesus Christ, God in the flesh. You have a resurrection of the God-man. You have the concept of the doctrine of the Trinity. You have justification through faith alone. You have, in the narratives, a physical resurrection. That's what you have, an ascension. All those contradict Muslims. So of course they got to come up with theories, and no, it's not universally agreed as to which theory or as to the nature of the gospel. Okay. Getting to the translation, and this is very interesting. The 7th century Christians, and before that, in that era, had one translation. We have to keep in mind there was no such thing as an Arabic translation until the 9th century, late 9th century. The Peshitta, which is in Syriac, it's literally simple. I mean, that's what that means, simple version or easy to understand kind of thing, was a very early Syriac translation of the Bible that could be traced back to the 2nd century. And the point is, this is what they had. This is the only translation they had. The earliest manuscripts of the Peshitta are found in the 5th century, in fact, but they go back to the 2nd century. And Syriac linguistically was a language or dialect of Aramaic. Now, the earliest Peshitta, now again, this is the only translation that the Christians, the people of the book, possessed. This was the book that they possessed. This would have been the book, this would have been the translation that was read to Muhammad. The earliest Peshitta, and the Peshitta is a Syriac translation of the Old and New Testament, but the earliest one, 2nd, 3rd century, contained the Old Testament, of course, with a lot of apocrypha books, but it contained the earliest ones, 22 New Testament books. The only ones that it excluded were the textually they're called the anti-legumena, which means disputed by some. It excluded 2nd Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation. Other than that, it had the entirety of the New Testament. And in fact, one of our earliest sources of the Gospels is by in Syriac, Tatian's Diatessaron. It's a huge work. Diatessaron is a Greek term that means through the four. And what Tatian did, a Syrian church father, what he did, he took all 4 Gospels and he made one giant book. And he looked at the parallels and all these things, and he made it a congruent harmony of the Gospels. Derek, this is the earliest source we have of any kind of harmony. And this was written probably about 150 AD. And, it's essentially has the same content we have in our hands today. But here's what's interesting. This was the standard Greek text in the Syrian, for the Syrian Middle East until about 400, AD 400. Eusebius makes mention of it, but it goes very early. And side note, the Assyrian Church of the East, they hold to this weird view called Peshitta primacy. And they would assert that the original New Testament was written literally in this Aramaic kind of text. But of course, there's no evidence to show. And the earliest manuscripts we have of the New Testament were in Greek. We don't have any that predate the Greek in Aramaic, not the earliest ones. And the Syriac, or the classical Syriac, was the dialogue of the Peshitta, and it was the most prolific classical Aramaic dialect in that time, between the 5th and 8th centuries, promulgated throughout the Middle East and parts of India and China, in fact. So in the region of Muhammad, the Bible translation of the so-called people of the book, Christians, would have been the Syriac Peshitta. That was their translation. Anything read to Muhammad would have been from that, because there were no other translations. There was no Greek text. There was no Arabic text. Nothing. There was no Slavonic text or Chinese. I mean, there was nothing. It was the Peshitta. So when people talk about the gospel, that the one that Muhammad had and he talked positively about, it would have been the Peshitta. There were no other translations. And as mentioned, the first Arabic Bible translation wasn't until the 9th century, 867, Codex 151, and most people in that region would have been familiar with the Aramaic dialect, right? Namely Syriac, which was normally spoken in the Near East at that time. So again, that would have been the translation of the people of the book. That's the translation. So if anyone says the New Testament Greek is corrupt in terms of Muslims, well, I mean, you can argue and show how silly that argument is based on historical manuscripts. But the fact of the matter is that Muhammad didn't use a Greek text. He used the Peshitta, which comports to the Greek text. It really does. And that's why there's so much, it's interesting, because as I was talking to you, very few Muslims know that was the only. And look, this is historical record. I'm not reaching for the stars trying to, come up with these arguments that can't be found historically. You can find it anywhere. This was the only translation promulgated that the people of the book possessed, that the Christians possessed. It was the Peshitta. And We know even in the Quran, as I think you alluded to, um, nowhere does the Quran teach that the gospel was corrupted. Nobody taught that, again, for 400 years. No one taught that. So the only gospel that Muhammad had was something that comported to the Bible that we have in our hands today. And even it's today the gospel and Torah that the Syrian church uses and embraced for in the 6th and 7th centuries in the time of Muhammad was fundamentally the same gospel that biblical Christians embrace today, that teaches the deity, the burial, the life, the death, the burial of resurrection of Jesus Christ, God in the flesh. All the deity of passages are intact in the Peshitta. And if you want, we can go look through some of those passages, which is very interesting because, as said before, some of the readings of the Peshitta, second, third century, comport with the critical text of the Greek that most almost all modern translations are based upon.
Now, that entire thing, to anyone that's studied history and understands how little historical evidence that we actually have from those time periods, to say that we have so many of these manuscripts out there is astounding. Considering that if you look at like the Battle of Troy, the history around that, we've got one writing from, I think it was 400 years after the event occurred. But to have all these manuscripts from the 2nd century that all agree doctrinally with what we currently have today is astounding,
Hmm.
is
Yeah,
absolutely breathtaking.
it really is. And I think even Christians, again, it's not a requirement that every Christian has to know stuff about textual reliability, because here, and I want to make this, I always make this point. Um, the normal means that God uses to save his people is the proclamation of the gospel. And Christians are always going to meet smarter people who are on the other side of the fence, who, as Paul says, are theologically atheistic. They're always going to meet them. People that are really smart, and they've got the list of skeptic arguments or arguments against the reliability and all these things. But keep in mind, the simple gospel presentation, the simple gospel proclamation, has the same efficacy, the same power today as it did when Paul wrote Romans 1:16. The gospel is the power of God for salvation. So never ever underestimate the efficacy of the plain and simple gospel. Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, he became flesh, he lived the perfect life on behalf of his people. He died on the cross, absorbing the wrath of his people. He was crucified. He was resurrected on the third day. And if you put your faith in him, you will be saved. That's a simple gospel presentation. Um, so, and I always tell Christians, don't waste a whole lot of time. Whatever group you're talking with, whether it's Muhammad, how much of a pedophile he was, and all the corruption of Muhammad, or the false prophecies of Jehovah's Witnesses, or the false prophecies and polytheistic doctrines of the Mormons. You can waste a whole lot of time. Here's the problem: you could spend an hour talking about false prophecies and all these things. But what if the guy or girl you're talking to gets a phone call? Then they have to go. You never got to the gospel, God's normal means of salvation. The power of God in salvation is the proclamation of the gospel. So get to my rule, and I always say this: get to the cross as fast as possible. That's what you got to do. Getting back to the New Testament reliability. First, yeah, we have almost 6,000 manuscripts. I mean, this isn't something that you can't, some fringe information. This can be this is verifiable. We have almost 6,000. I mean, the exact number I think right now is 5,838. But again, those numbers keep going up. Almost 6,000 Greek New Testament manuscripts from the early 2nd century, from the early, and some would speculate we have a few that may be the late first, but for the most part, 2nd century to the 16th, around there, century, in terms of just manuscripts, we have about 6,000. You know how many manuscripts that is? If you got all the Greek manuscripts, Derek, and you went outside, I couldn't do that here. There's too many buildings in Los Angeles. But if you laid all the Greek manuscripts, just all the pages, you would have about right now about 2 million manuscripts, 2.6 million pages of Greek, 2.6 million of pages of Greek. So when we say 6,000 manuscripts, keep in mind the average size of a manuscript was about 300 or 400 pages. Sometimes they were this big, might have 2 verses on it. Sometimes they were just pages and pages in codex. And no other book of antiquity comes even close. These people who would never dream of questioning any other work of antiquity, all of a sudden they have a different criteria when it comes to the scriptures. That's a whole lot of manuscripts. And let me tell you, John 1:1 from the 2nd century reads the same way as the latest manuscripts. In other words, there's no viable variant of John 1:1. The verse that we have in our hand, the readings that we have in our hand, corresponds with the earliest Greek manuscripts from the 2nd century on John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and theos hein halagos. God, theos, God was the Word. In every manuscript that appears, that reading appears. And no viable variants in there. When we look at the Peshitta, the translation of the Christians, the book that the Christians possessed. So when Muhammad talks about the book, well, it was that. When Muhammad reads or references a dozen times the INJIL, the gospel, well, that was the one that was read to him. There was no other. Keep that in mind. There was no other. It was the Syriac Peshitta. For example, Matthew 14:33 in the Peshitta, we have the same reading we have today. All those in the boat, we read, and they who were in the boat, after Jesus was walking on the water. It's recorded in the Peshitta. All those who were in the boat came, and here's the reading in the Peshitta, worshipped him, Christ, and said, truly, you are the Son of God. Hebrews 1:6 reads the same way in the Peshitta, but just dealing with the gospel. Because we'll see Paul as the inventor of these doctrines and all these things. And the author of Hebrews, we have to throw that out as well, according to Muslims. So just dealing with the INJIL, the gospel. Matthew 14:33 is an affirmation by the Peshitta, the translations that the Christians had, that Jesus Christ not only was worshipped, but they affirmed he was the Son of God. In Mark 1:1 of the Peshitta, Jesus is called Son of God. One of my favorite references in Mark 14:62, actually that whole narrative about the high priest asking him, are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of the Blessed One? Jesus' response, he said, I like this verse. It reads just like our translations, these verses, because Jesus adds something just to make clear, crystal clear, that he was identified as Yahweh, the one who rides on the clouds. He said to him, remember, the priest asks, are you the Messiah, the Son of God, or the Son of the Blessed One? Mark 14:62 reads like this, in the Peshitta, Jesus, he said to him, I am, and you shall see. Here's what Jesus adds. So he's the Son of God, he's the Messiah. He says, I am, and Jesus adds, you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power, coming in the clouds. And of course, the priest tore his clothes. And, do we need another witness? He says. He says he's the Son of Man. That's a reference from Daniel 7. Riding the clouds. Only Yahweh rides the clouds. And this is all in the Peshitta. In John 1:1, it reads like we have basically, fundamentally, what we have in our scriptures today. But look at verse 3 in the Peshitta. I don't know if anyone has their Peshitta, but in John 1:1 reads like our Bibles today. In verse 3, everything was by his hand, Christ. Everything was by his hand. This is the reading in the Peshitta translation. And without him was not anything, whatever, that existed. And same with verse 10, the Peshitta 1:10, and the world was by his hand. In John 1:14, it reads like ours, the word became flesh. In John 1:18, now here, very interesting, Derek, in John 1:18, it reads like the critical text, the modern Greek text, or the critical text in which modern translations upon which they use to translate. But this reading goes back, it's the earliest reading of John 1:18. And we read this in the Peshitta, in the 3rd century Peshitta. No man has ever seen God, the one and only God. That's from the Greek, monogenes theos, the one and only God, or only begotten God, he who is in the bosom of the Father hath declared him. He calls Christ in John refers to Christ as the one and only God, but this is the reading in the Peshitta. And same with in Etheridge translation, we read in 824, unless you believe that I am, you will die in your sins. 1030, I and the Father are one. How about this? John 14:14, again, agreeing with the critical text, we have the pronoun, me. Jesus says, according to Peshitta, John 14:14, if you or ye shall ask of me, pray to me, in my name I will do it. Jesus is instructing people to pray to him. And let me just give you one more on the deity of Christ, because I think it's a better reading than most modern translations. Again, this is from the Peshitta, Romans 9:5. Because linguistically, there can be some ambiguity in this text, but some translations really, we have a very clear reading as to the reference, as to the referential identity, God overall. Here's how the Peshitta reads in Romans 9:5. And from among who Messiah appeared in the flesh, who is God over all, to whom praises and benediction forever and ever. Amen. That's how it reads in the Peshitta. It makes Christ the referential identity of God over all. And we can go on and on and on about all the resurrection. All the crosswork passages are namely intact in the narrative. Mark 10:45, the Son of Man did not come here to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for the many. That's in the Peshitta. And all the resurrection and burial passages, the main ones, they're all in the Peshitta. His claim to be the agent of his own resurrection in John 2:19 through 22, when he says, demolish this temple, I'll raise it up in 3 days. And then in verse 21 of chapter 2, he spake of his temple, the temple of his own body. And it says his disciples remember this. This is showing that Christ was the agent of his own resurrection. And of course, John 19:30, it is finished. It is finished. So the fact of the matter in the Peshitta, all the essential doctrines are intact. And this is the translation that Muhammad used. This is the only translation that the Christians in that region would have used. So I think it's a great point to bring out, because a lot of Muslims aren't aware of this fact. Not that they, again, we got to rely on the Lord opening their eyes, because you can be crystal clear and just logical and articulate and all these things, and just bear all this evidence out, but it doesn't guarantee they're gonna just say, okay, I want to go to your church, I want to be baptized. Remember with Luke 16, the rich man Lazarus, the rich man wanted to warn his brothers who were still living. He's in torment in Hades, and Abraham tells him, even if someone raises from the dead, they're still not going to come to faith, right? They still won't believe, even if they saw empirical evidence. So we have to look at it in that way too. But I would definitely let the gospel speak for itself. The gospel the Christians had in their hand. Let that gospel speak. The gospel, the New Testament, the gospel proclamations that the Christians had in their hand in the 7th century, that Muhammad spoke about, because that's the only translation. So we can fairly deduce that that's what he spoke about when he mentioned the INJIL 12 times. The Peshitta, who affirms our faith. The Peshitta is on our side, and it's consistent in terms of essential theology, it's consistent to what we have in our hand in all the Greek manuscripts.
I'd definitely say that's even reinforced again in the Quran, specifically in 4:171. You're mentioning John 1:1, where it's talking about Jesus being the Word. In the Quran, Jesus is referred to as the Word of Allah twice. One in 4:147 and another one in 3:39. So again, the Quran is basically restating that Jesus is the Word, and he's the only one who's given this word title as the Word of Allah, which would be right in line with what we read in John 1:1.
So yeah, someone read to Muhammad John 1:1 and John 4 and 1:14 in Revelation. He is the word. You really do. Let me tell you something. What I think, Derek, when we have this kind of evidence, when we can show empirically, objectively, verifiably this kind of evidence, you really understand when they reject it. You really understand that this whole thing is spiritual. It's not a question of how smart they are. It's not a question of intellection. It really isn't. It's a spiritual issue. They are just blind as can be. That's why before it's a good idea for all Christians. You should just pray, that God would open their eyes as you present the simplicity of the gospel and some of these points.
Absolutely. As I've always said and reminded everyone who reaches out to Muslims or reaches out to any cult or anyone who's lost, do remember that they are not your enemy. They're not your opponent. They are not someone to be hated or despised. They are the hostages of the enemy. They're the ones being held captive. And your job is as to play a small role as the rescuer, to come alongside and help guide with the Holy Spirit and to rely upon the Holy Spirit's guidance in those, of course. But that's our position. So constantly praying for the lost people, constantly praying for Muslims to come to this fullness of life in Jesus Christ. That is our deepest hope.
Yes.
So if
Yeah. And
anyone has any questions, I know we've got one that I've starred that we'll go over. If you guys have any questions, you're welcome to join us live on here and have a discussion about it. So I've left it in the chat. I've pinned it at the top. So it's not complicated to come in. You just have to tell us what mics you want to use, and I won't require you to use a webcam. So you'd be good with that. But we do have a question about the second century manuscripts and what the confirmation, how do they confirm that it's from the second century?
Oh, paleographically, when just like any secular manuscript, they don't just look at the content, but rather the word size or the word shape, and how the Greek in the first century or second century. For example, I'll give you an example. Second century manuscripts and third century manuscripts, when they would come to the word God or Jesus or holy, this was called the nomina sacra. They would abbreviate it. So instead of writing the whole name, Jesus, like for Jesus, they would abbreviate it. Normally, they would either conflate it or they'd write the first letter and the last letter. And they'd put a line so it's being abbreviated. Now, this is indicative to second century manuscripts and third century. So we know when we come to manuscripts, I mean, that's one of the things. But also, what was found with the manuscripts? What artifacts were found with the manuscript? What kind of paper was it written on? For instance, early manuscripts, even in secular manuscripts, were written not on vellum, not on animal skins. They were written on papyrus, right? And papyri was a material from a papyrus plant. They would take the reed off, they would spread it out and make like paper on it. So based on the materials, it's easy to see, to calculate dates. So material, linguistics, what was found around the manuscript, paleographical tests. So it's not really difficult to get back to the at least give a time window. Sometimes it's arranged. Sometimes it's, you know, most of these manuscripts were not dated like January 4th, 19. Well, it wouldn't be 19, but they weren't dated. But in terms of the manuscripts, that's how all those. It's not just one test; it's a litany of different tests, and it's not difficult to get to a range of time. It's really not disputed that much either.
So Mel, you're more than welcome to join us and give your opinion as well. I know you've always got great insights. But it claims there is no Islamic Injil. This is the Injil that the Quran is referring to, is what we've been talking about. Written in the language that would have been around and definitely around the area of Muhammad during his time as acclaimed prophet.
The only translation that was in that region as evidence.
So if you guys don't jump on here and have more questions for us, we will be wrapping up shortly. Real quick, Eddie, what do you have that you're working on right now that you'd like people to know about?
Visit the website. I have a YouTube page too, slowly adding content, but visit the website as well. We have a lot of information. There's some few books that I've been involved with and that I wrote. One of the books I wrote was on oneness theology, but I just finished a book. It's a basic introduction to Christian apologetics. It's in the process of being published right now, so I will have that. Hopefully in the next 2 or 3 weeks it will actually be published and on the website. And any questions, please email me. My email's on the website, and again, visit the YouTube page. And that's what I'm working on right now. That's what I actually just finished, and then I'm not sure after that what writing projects I'm going to do, but something.
If you guys want to check that out, the link is in the description, as well as Dr. Eddie Dalcour's YouTube channel is also there as well. So please go check those out. They are great sources of information. And definitely, if you're very curious to pursue this further, I'd recommend you check those out. On my end, we are preparing for the Ministry to Muslims conference in Ohio that will be coming up shortly. We'll be associated with that, and you guys are all welcome to come and join us there. The link is in the description below if you guys want to learn about apologetics and actually apply it and engage. This would be a great opportunity. It is in August, coming up at the very beginning of August. So thank you guys so much for coming and joining us. Thank you, Dr. Eddie Dalcour, for coming on and giving us such good information.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Derek.
Absolutely. And just like always, we will end in prayer. Lord of heaven and earth, we come before you. We thank you for the opportunity to dive into your word, to see how many overwhelming number of manuscripts that we have that confirm what we believe. I pray for any Muslim who watches this or is currently watching this, that you put your hand upon them, that you guide them out of the darkness of Islam, out of that shadow into the light that can only be found in Jesus Christ, and the freedom that can only be bought through the blood of the cross. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen.